Oops. It is HR 2294 is in the House bill, and S 2266 is the House bill, or pardon me, the Senate bill. At the end of today's program, you'll have an opportunity to link and take some action. This really is a call for action. So again, it is part of our advocacy and outreach. We hope that you'll write your legislators to let them know that you support this bill. And this is what you're going to learn about today. So we have two speakers with us today. Mike Phillips, who's Policy Director with the National Trust Community Investment Corporation, and Patrick Robertson, who's with us today from the National Tax Credit Coalition. He's the Executive Director of the coalition, and each will explain a little bit more about their respective roles within their businesses and affiliations. So with that, I want to turn it over to Mike and Patrick to begin the program.
Great, thank you, Cindy. Patrick, can you see my screen?
I cannot see your screen. Is this a test?
Yes, it is. All right, how about now?
Yep, there you go, Mike.
Great.
While you're pulling up your images, I want to mention to everyone that you can go ahead and chat during our conversation with our guest today. And we encourage you to go ahead and post where you're calling in from. And John and I will be posting a lot of links for you to follow, which will help you to follow what the speakers are talking about. So if you want to go ahead and you can use that chat window, if it bothers you, you can pull it to the side or minimize it. Okay, you're on, Mike.
All right, great. Well, my name's Mike Phillips. I'm with National Trust Community Investment Corporation. I'm the Director of Public Policy. I work actively with the Historic Tax Credit Coalition, which the president of NTCIC is the chair of, and work closely with Patrick Robertson, who's the Executive Director. Patrick.
Sure. Thanks, Mike. And thanks to Cindy and John and the whole California team for having us today. We are, as Cindy said, I'm the Executive Director of the Federal Historic Tax Credit Coalition, but what I really am is a lobbyist in DC who lobbies mainly on tax issues. I've got my own firm called Confluence Government Relations, but one of the things I spend my most time on is the historic tax credit. So you all know, obviously, the historic tax credit probably better even than I do. At the same time, I think it's worth taking a 30-second overview of where the HTC has been over the years to talk about where we're going, right? So the historic tax credit began as a preservation incentive in the late 1970s as a deduction, eventually became a credit and locked in to a 20% credit in the tax reform bill of 1986. After that, the credit largely remained the same. A few changes around the edges, a few thises and that's, a few IRS regulations. Obviously, the Secretary's standards evolved at the Park Service. And then we saw a period of activity in the late 2010s that really changed the market significantly. There was the historic Boardwalk Hall case out of New Jersey that sort of changed what it meant to be a partner in HTC transactions. And then there was IRS safe harbor that came from that made you understand how to do deals a little better. Then there was the IRS's 50D ruling on these crazy phantom income requirements for investors. And then tax reform came, and tax reform eliminated the 10% credit and made the 20% credit a 5-year credit instead of a 1-year credit. So the sort of sleepy historic tax credit that's always been in the code, that wasn't part of what were traditionally called the tax extenders, didn't have to be reauthorized every year or 2 or 3, depending on the time, like the new markets tax credit did, now is a credit that's worth a little bit less than it was in 1986, and certainly a lot less than it was in the early 2010s after some of the changes that took place. So one of the things the Historic Tax Credit Coalition did was it sort of sat down and talked a little about what it would take to put value back into the credit. And the answer to that question is the Historic Tax Credit Growth and Opportunity Act. So we can talk a little bit about that bill in a minute. First, I want to talk about what's going on in Congress for a little bit. Mike, I just want to mention to you, I'm not seeing the slides up yet. So as those of you, I see Keith Bettis's face on my screen as well. For those of you who know me, you know I can talk no matter what for as long as I need to, whether I have slides or not. So not a problem, but we'll try to get those up and get going. But right now, when you think about national politics and you think a little bit about the presidential election of 2020, which obviously we all should have I survived the presidential election of 2020 t-shirts, especially if you lived in a swing state, California a little less so. But if you were in a place that President Biden and former President Trump wanted to win in 2020 and there was some contention, you saw more ads than you want to know. So here's where we ended up, right? We ended up with, now I see the slide, so hopefully everybody else does. We ended up with 220 Democrats and 212 Republicans in the House. For those of you history buffs, you'll note there's 435 House seats. 3 of them are currently vacant. Marcia Fudge resigned to become the HUD Secretary. Mr. Hastings and Mr. Sivers also left their seats this year. And so we're waiting for special elections to fill those seats. You know, and the one thing I always have to remind myself is it looks like Democrats have an 8-vote advantage, right? And those of you who are living in California or from there or have moved there, I will confess to you now that I grew up in West Virginia where our school system isn't as good as that one does in California. And so I always have to remind myself on the math side, just because there's an 8-point spread in votes here, it's really 4, right? If 4 Republicans vote, or if 4 Democrats vote with Republicans, it's tied 216-216, right? So it's not some huge margin that they have to work with. It's not even 8 votes, it's just 4. And 4 votes out of 432 isn't that many. Even my West Virginia math tells me that's close to 1%, right? So all of that being said, the House is astronomically close. So far this year, they've passed some Democratic priorities. They did the American Rescue Plan, which was the president's sort of signature COVID recovery package at the beginning of the year through budget reconciliation. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But now we're waiting to see what they're going to do about infrastructure. And, you know, I see there's about 70, 75 people on this call. All 75 of us would probably give different definitions of what infrastructure is. Right? We'd all say roads and bridges, but some of us might say childcare centers. Some of us might say schools. Some of us might say historic buildings. Some of us might say parks. Some of us might say airports, right? And so what Congress is currently trying to do is sort through all those priorities and come to an infrastructure package. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But before we do that, let's go, Mike, really quickly to the Senate and what the Senate, or well, this is House, well, we'll go back just, sorry. House leadership, obviously, the important piece on this for you all is that California's very own Nancy Pelosi, who sometimes is Baltimore's very own Nancy Pelosi, depending on what era of her life she's talking about, is the Speaker of the House and has an outsized influence. Mr. McCarthy from outside of Bakersfield is the Republican leader. And as you know, there are more Californians than you can shake a stick at in Washington. And so your delegation really does have a significant outsized influence. When you look at the tax committee, which is next, the chairman of the tax committee is a guy named Richie Neal. He's from Springfield, Illinois. He's been a long time sort of business-friendly Democrat who's now grappling with the squad or the progressive wing of the party, or however you want to describe the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Cori Bush, Congresswoman Tlaib, Congresswoman Omar faction of the party. It's not that much different than California Democrats, although maybe a little more outspoken these days. Californians also pay a little deference to the speaker. He's matched up with Kevin Brady, who's from Texas. Mr. Brady is term limited as being the top Republican on the House Ways and Means Committee, so he's going to leave at the end of the year. And Mr. Nunez from California, as well as Vern Buchanan and Adrian Smith are sort of the 3 potential replacements. You know, in Washington, and I hate to even admit this, but our favorite parlor game is to replace the person long before they leave. So we're already thinking about who the next ranking Republican will be, especially since Republicans' eyes are as big as saucers thinking about potentially retaking the House next November. As you can see, we've tried to sort of lay out a slide presentation about where we are. I don't know that a black and white 50-50 is the most graphically pleasing representation, but that's what the Senate's all about. The Senate's exactly a 50-50 split. It's really hard to do anything in a 50-50 Senate in a good year. In a bad year, it's even harder. The vice president, who, you know, a lot of people bash the vice president's job, not necessarily the vice president, but the job of the vice president. But the one thing that Vice President Harris always gets to do is break a tie in the Senate. So if there are tie votes 50-50, she gets to come in and break them in the administration's favor. So we've got her picture here. So let's go on to the next slide, please, Mike. So when you think about all these things put together, Joe Biden comes into office, you know, some people questioning whether he should be there or not, but lays out an agenda that really looks to move government spending forward. So you have the American Rescue Plan, which is a multi-trillion-dollar COVID relief package. Then you have the American Jobs Plan, which is another $2 trillion. And then you have the American Families Plan, which is another multi-trillion-dollar bill. So this is just a quick outline of the jobs plan. And when you look at this, you see fix highways, rebuild bridges, upgrade ports, airports, and transit centers, drinking infrastructure, rehabilitate homes, buildings, schools, federal buildings, caregiving jobs. What you're really looking at is the blueprint for this bipartisan infrastructure bill that's out there right now. Now, you can create caregiving jobs off. You can cross some of the sort of what I will call soft infrastructure. And again, 75 people, 75 different definitions of infrastructure. But when you really think about it, this bipartisan bill is a hard infrastructure bill. It's things that you can touch and feel and sort of understand as infrastructure. And why is it bipartisan? So that's sort of the big question. And we're going to get to how it happened here in a minute. But let me just talk about what's really at the base of this. The reason it's bipartisan is twofold. One, because the president wants it to be bipartisan. He ran on the idea that he can bring everybody together, talk about important issues to America, and sort of have a plan. So he's pushing for it to be bipartisan. And Republicans, with a likable guy like Joe Biden, who's sort of everybody's buddy and who has a trust of the American people when he speaks that's, it's not unique, but it's rare in politics, right? And not everybody trusts him. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to suggest that people trust him universally. But when he says he tries to do things in a bipartisan fashion, people believe that. And so Republicans couldn't spend 2 whole years being against everything that the president put out, and then say that we should be in charge, right? Because there would be no argument that the government would work then. Now, there's certainly a subset of the electorate that doesn't want the government to work, but they're not the majority. The majority of voters want the government to work. So they couldn't do that. So, A, the president wants a bipartisan package, and so do some of the moderate Senate Democrats. B, Republicans can't stand all for 2 years for no. And the third reason is Republicans want to vote against all the huge government spending and taxes that may be on the back end in a reconciliation package that we'll talk about. And to do that, you got to be for something again. So they're going to try to be for this bipartisan. So American Jobs Plan, just on taxes really quickly, most of these are going to get dumped into the reconciliation bill. Sometimes when I do these presentations, I have a bunch of tax lawyers on, and let me tell you, they are boring humans, but they are really smart and they are really good at saving people money. So I don't want to sort of disparage them, but I leave these details in just so they can't say I didn't get to them. If you don't care about the global intangible low tax income rate, we could probably be friends, and I'm okay with that. So we'll go ahead on to the next slide. So the bipartisan talks. So we're going to start in the upper right-hand corner of your slides with my friend and West Virginia Senator Shelley Moore Capito. She spent 3 or 4 weeks negotiating with Joe Biden over a bipartisan package, and she and he could not really come to an agreement. So in jumped Rob Portman, who's on your screen to the left of her. He's a senator from Ohio. He's got a really interesting resume. He was in the House. He worked in George W. Bush's White House as the United States Trade Representative. He's in the Senate. Everybody trusts him. And he and senior advisor Steve Ricchetti, who's a longtime Biden friend and staff, came together and made a bipartisan deal. They announced it last Friday or last Thursday. They drafted it over the weekend. It's on the Senate floor now. And again, Republicans didn't want to go back and undo the tax reform from the Trump years. They didn't want new taxes. They're not getting them. They didn't want huge spending programs. They want to focus on roads and bridges, and they want to pay for it. And they got pretty close. You know, you'll see this sort of alternatively referred to as a $1.5 trillion bill or a $600 billion in new spending bill. You can call it either one, and both are accurate. But they're debating that on the Senate floor right now. So we'll talk a little bit about how we got there on the next slide as well. So here are the details. You'll see there are no community development tax credits here. There are no real tax policies. They're taxing cryptocurrency and increasing reporting and doing some other things. But there's not this huge tax title like you'll see in the next bill. So we can go ahead and skip to the next piece, Mike. And budget reconciliation is next. And so what does that mean? What's budget reconciliation? Who's in charge of budget reconciliation? Why is there a purple donkey on this slide? There's a lot of questions I can't answer. Not sure I can answer that one. So the two senators at the bottom are Joe Manchin, also from West Virginia, and Kyrsten Sinema from Arizona. And they are moderate Democrats. And here's what happened. Hero of the left and sometimes Democrat Bernie Sanders, sometimes socialist, which is the party he usually identified with, is the chairman of the Senate Budget Committee. And he came out and said, I want a $6 trillion budget reconciliation bill. I want to do everything I've wanted to do my whole career. If you've ever heard Senator Sanders or presidential candidate Sanders speak, you will know that every eighth word is poverty. And he's very focused on eradicating poverty in America. So he comes out with a $6 trillion wish list. And Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, I mean, Joe Manchin doesn't do this a whole lot, but it does reflect his mood a lot of the time. They come out and say, hold your horses. In order to do budget reconciliation, you need 50 votes. And if you remember from our very fancy black and white graphic a few minutes ago, there are exactly 50 Democratic senators. So to get those 50 votes, you have to make everybody happy. You have to make Bernie Sanders happy, and you have to make Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema happy, or John Tester, who's a wheat farmer in Montana, who's also a senator. So they've settled on a $3.5 trillion budget reconciliation bill. Corporate tax rate probably doesn't go beyond 25%. There has to be a bipartisan infrastructure bill first. But there's also a lot of things that people want to do. And they want those soft infrastructure things we talked about, building childcare centers, finding people to work in them, doing some of the climate things, changing our relationship with carbon. There's a ton of stuff that folks want to do that they're going to try to do in there. So I'm almost at my time, so I'm going to try to speed up, but I do just want to just slow down for a second and explain how the budget reconciliation process works. It's a tool that was set up to allow a majority party that can't overcome a filibuster to make some spending and taxing decisions. And there's just a couple of simple rules. The first rule is all of the provisions have to be directly related to raising or spending money for the federal government. And so the Republicans and President Trump passed the tax cuts in 2017 by using budget reconciliation. And I use this example because I think it's really valuable. They called that bill the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, right? That was the title. There is a woman in the Senate who is called the Senate parliamentarian, and her job is to decide what complies with the Byrd Rule. And the Byrd Rule is named after another West Virginian. You think I'm just talking about West Virginia because I'm from there. But all of a sudden, West Virginia has this bizarre outsized influence in Washington that likely won't last. But the majority leader in the Senate used to be this guy named Robert C. Byrd, who many of you may or may not have heard of. He served in the Senate for approximately 378 years. And one of his contributions is the Byrd Rule. The Byrd Rule says If you're not related to spending or raising taxes, you have to come out of the reconciliation package. So this woman named Elizabeth McDonough, who's the parliamentarian, she gets to rule on what's in and out of budget reconciliation. You can appeal her ruling, you can vote to overturn it, but her ruling is pretty final and most people respect her. If anyone had Senate parliamentarian on your bingo card today, you're the winner, by the way. So here's the fun cocktail conversation I'm going to share really quick. When she reviews every word of the bill to see if it's bird rule compliant, we call that a bird bath, right? So the bill gets bathed by the parliamentarian, it's a bird bath, and then the things that fall out are called bird dropping, right? So bird rule, bird bath, bird droppings, good to go. So one of the bird droppings in tax reform was the title. It wasn't called the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. It was called a bill to amend the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 and for other purposes, because the title didn't directly affect spending or raising money, so it fell out. So those are the kinds of decisions that they make in reconciliation. Reconciliation is painful on purpose. The majority party has to pass a budget, and then in that budget, there are reconciliation instructions. Those go back to the committees of jurisdiction. They come back to the budget committee. They report a bill to the floor. And in both instances, when there are floor votes, there are these things called vote-a-rama, where you have to dispose of every amendment offered in the Senate, and there could be thousands. You usually end up voting on a few dozen, but you have to deal with all of them. So why did I just spend 8 minutes of your day that you're never getting back talking about budget reconciliation? Because that's where most of the changes are going to happen. That's where people are telling us HTC improvements are likely to happen. And so when you think about budget reconciliation and you think partisan, nonpartisan, bipartisan, apartisan, political, whatever, know that the budget reconciliation bill that we're all hoping to see this fall is likely to include the provisions of the Historic Tax Credit Growth and Opportunity Act, which is a really fancy way of saying HTC GO, which is our short nomenclature for the bill. So Mike, we'll go ahead to the next slide. It used to be that we had a big picture of Elizabeth McDonough so people could recognize her when they were out and about, but we dropped that. So just a couple of quick project examples. You know, historic preservation, and especially the historic tax credit, really is infrastructure. The greenest building is a building that's already built. You're taking existing building stock that's in the private sector, and you're putting that into or back into productive commerce, right? Places like Cincinnati, New Orleans, Richmond, these places have seen these changes over the years where their buildings have fallen into disrepair, used the HTC to come back like the Pythian in New Orleans. You're seeing some of it in California. You know, you all have a ton of mid-century modern architecture. I was just out in LA and San Luis Obispo and Paso Robles a couple weeks ago, looking around and thinking about HTC projects, which was a lot of fun for me. But your mid-century modern buildings are due. It's time, and you all have this great state credit now. So California has for years punched below its weight in the federal HTC program. Now it has the chance to punch above its weight, especially if we expand the credit. So Mike, we'll go ahead to the next slide. We talked a little bit about the greenest building as a building that's already there. Obviously, it also takes a lot of skilled labor to rehab a building. We always say that in new construction, we think labor is 40% of materials or 60, where it's flipped in rehab, 60% labor, 40% materials. This is the Hone Lithograph building in Baltimore. We can go ahead to the next slide, Mike. And Duncan Biotech in St. Louis. Tons of good stuff you can do. One of the provisions we'll talk about is one that benefits nonprofits. And that's where you get some of these job incubators, homeless services centers, schools, everything else. And we'll go on one more, Mike. Great. So now let's talk about the Historic Tax Credit Growth and Opportunity. We had it. Now we're back, Mike. Sorry. There we go. Now we'll talk about the Historic Tax Credit Growth and Opportunity Act. So this is a bill, as Cindy said, it's a bipartisan bill in the House, represented by Mr. Introduced by Mr. Blumenauer and Mr. LaHood. I'm going to take these backward. I'm going to do the bottom four and then the top one. It takes the four longtime permanent priorities of the Historic Tax Credit Coalition and the community and would make them law. The first is all small credits under $2.5 million in QREs would get a 30% credit. This helps even out some of those inequities and some of the, you have to spend as much as on lawyers and accountants on small deals as you do on large deals. Secondly, it would lower the substantial rehab threshold to 50% of your adjusted basis. So currently you have to spend 100% of your adjusted basis on rehab. They call that the substantial rehab test. I call it the complete or total rehab test. I think it's sort of a little too far, so it adjusts it down to 50. It would eliminate the basis adjustment. So bear with me. We're going to do math again, and I apologize. You all, again, in California are probably much better at it than this West Virginia kid. But in the current system, if you buy a building for $100, we'll call that your adjusted basis, and then you do $100 in rehab, you would think your basis would be $200. But because you get a 20% tax credit on that $100, you then have to adjust your basis down by $20 to $180. So then if you sell your building, you have to pay tax on $120 instead of $100 if you sell it for $300. So the basis adjustment taxes the tax benefit, but secondarily, it also creates something called 50D phantom income that in a larger deal, the developer and the investor have to work out how to deal with. So take all that aside, this eliminates the basis adjustments. You don't have that problem. And then finally, it makes it easier for nonprofits to own buildings that get rehab. Now, nonprofits cannot claim a tax credit because they are nonprofits and they don't pay tax. But they ought to be able to own the building, get an investor in, create a partnership, you still use the building, and be able to use this great tool for redevelopment. And this provision would get rid of the disqualified lease rules and allow you to do that. And then finally, back to the top, temporarily, the bill would move the credit from 20 to 30% for all projects to help overcome the ravages of the pandemic that include uncertain real estate, higher sort of risk factors and less lending and banking, higher material costs, higher labor costs, less reliable labor, tougher to get back-end tenants like hotels and office buildings when nobody's traveling and no one's around. So that's what the House bill does. Mike, we'll flip to the Senate bill, and I promise I'm almost done talking, and we're going to flip it to Mike here in a minute. The Senate bill, which is from Senator Cardin, Cassidy, Cantwell, and Collins, would take those 4 permanent provisions and make them law. And then I just talked to Senator Cardin's staff today, and they're looking at introducing a standalone on that temporary provision, which is really one of the priorities of the industry for that temporary bump up. And he's looking to introduce that maybe as early as this week, but at the latest when they get back from their summer recess, which goes into next week. So that would, again, have that 20 to 30% boost. So Mike, we'll go ahead on to the next slide. I embarrassingly don't know what that beautiful building is, but now I have the pleasure to turn it over to Mike. Mike might be able to tell us what that building is, and then talk to us a little bit about sort of the pandemic effects on the market, which I talked about more quickly than was warranted. And then a little bit about how to advocate and who to talk to about being on board with this. Oh, look, the chat beat you to it, Mike. They all know it's in Cincinnati.
Yeah, Union Terminal, Cincinnati, beautiful project, was dormant, vacant for a long time, and they've resurrected it. It's beautiful. Yeah, thank you, Patrick. So like I said before, I'm with National Trust Community Investment Corporation. We help bring investors into historic tax credit projects, new market tax credit projects, and solar tax credit projects. We've seen, and the industry has seen, a lot of impact from COVID, obviously on site, labor shortages, and then you have the jump in materials, the cost of lumber, but also in the financing realm, where these projects are typically riskier than new construction. Banks tend to loan less to these projects, and banks have pulled back during the pandemic on risk. And so where you were getting 60% of the project loan in debt, and now they're scaling back to maybe 50%. So I'll just really quickly go over kind of some case studies. I wouldn't call them case studies, they're just snippets of what can kind of go wrong in a project. Here you have a project from a nonprofit that's going to be a civil rights museum and have 25 units of affordable senior housing. So their rents are restricted, and COVID hits, and they have delays, they have cost overruns. And how are they going to make it up? They have fixed rents for senior housing. They can't just increase the rents on all of that. So there's a gap. There's a $925,000 gap because of the cost overruns, the increased costs, and the delays. And so how is that going to be made up? So we are hopeful that we can get this boost passed through Congress, which would allow more tax credits to this project, which would allow this project to leverage more equity. And on to the next one. This is a hospitality one. Everybody knows what's happened with hospitality. Very difficult to be in the hospitality industry. Loan commitment was retracted, and the bank wants to loan less to this project. They know the cash flow is not going to be what they first were presented because of the pandemic. There's challenging competition within this city for residential and office space. It's saturated, so it's very difficult for this project to suddenly turn on a dime and become a new use. Although our legislation would be helpful to that. Reducing the substantial rehab test would allow a project, instead of 100% basis, would be 50% basis. So it wouldn't have to be totally falling down. You could actually have a project with enough costs to qualify for the credit to convert a hotel into housing or something like that. So here you see a $3 million financing gap that was unforeseen, and that is resulted from issues related to the pandemic. And once again, this boost will be helpful. The basis adjustment provision, that's a permanent provision, would allow better pricing for the tax credits. That would be very helpful. So you're just seeing a lot of projects that they are dying from 1,000 cuts, right? It's materials, it's labor shortages, it's time, it's permits slowing, it's carrying costs. They're not getting the revenue, the tenants are pulling out. So there's just multiple factors weighing in on these projects, to where the easiest thing to do is to allow these projects to temporarily have more tax credits and be able to leverage more equity into them. Jumping back to Congress. So here's the House bill. Here are the present co-sponsors of them. We got about 60 co-sponsors on the bill, doing very well. This bill has only been out for 2.5 or 3 months. So we want to keep driving that co-sponsor list up, and want to show the committees that are undertaking infrastructure that the historic tax credit has broad support, both on the Republican side and the Democrat side. And when they are working on the infrastructure bill and considering community investment incentives, they see that, hey, this is bipartisan support. There's a lot of support out there. So when our champion of the bill comes and says, I want this in the bill, they know that there's a general realm of support for the provisions. So now we move to the tax writing committees. So Ways and Means Committee, California has 6 members on the Ways and Means Committee. That's the most out of any state. So we are very hopeful that some of these members of Congress are your members of Congress, and you are constituents of them, and you will weigh in with them and say, the Historic Tax Credit Growth and Opportunity Act is important. Please co-sponsor the bill, and please include this in an infrastructure bill as this piece of legislation emerges under reconciliation. The Senate Finance Committee, so this is the tax writing committee in the Senate. No California folks there, but we do have a lot of good support on the committee. This was the committee that saved the historic tax credit and tax reform. Senator Cassidy, a Republican from Louisiana, led the charge and had multiple folks on the Republican side supporting him to reinstate the historic tax credit. And then on the Democratic side, you had a bunch of Democratic senators saying the historic tax credit is a good thing. This is ridiculous that we have this eliminated. We need to reinstate this. And so there are friends on both the Ways and Means Committee and on the Senate Finance Committee. And as this infrastructure bill starts moving through these committees, these champions of the historic tax credit will start to weigh in, but they need support from their colleagues. So as we have the sponsors of our bill, like Earl Blumenauer of Oregon, saying this is important to have in the bill, it would be great if we could get Mr. Thompson of California, Ms. Chu to weigh in and say, hey, this is also important to our districts, and we support what Congressman Blumenauer is doing. So I think I said it, but here it is again. Our request to members of Congress is to co-sponsor both the House bill and the Senate bill, and then look for opportunities to include these provisions in the emerging infrastructure legislation. This is probably the most critical time right now in advocacy. This webinar is perfect timing. Between now, August and September, and possibly through the fall, they will be legislating on this reconciliation bill. And the more members of Congress that go to the chairman and House and Senate leadership and say, hey, the historic tax credit is important. We need these enhancements, the more likely we are to get into this bill. And it also firms up the folks that are supporting this bill. When they hear from you, it kind of strengthens their backbone even more, to where they are a bit of a bulldog when it comes to fighting for these provisions in the legislation. So one thing you can do when you're communicating, obviously ask to co-sponsor the bill, but if you've experienced or know of projects that have experienced challenges resulting from the pandemic, share those. Share cost overruns, new financing gaps, share issues getting loans with banks, how projects have slowed down there locally. And then we also have some easy ways to take action, which I think are going to be dropped into the chat. The National Trust for Historic Preservation has an e-advocacy tool that you can use, and that will just shoot you right into this congressional letter writing portal, and you can voice your support of that. We also have fact sheets. You can see the provisions in detail for each fact sheet. For the boost, you can see how many years we have the boost and how it ramps down, and the percentage ramps down as well. So these are resources to help you with that. Obviously, Patrick and I are happy to help you in any way in communicating with legislators. And I know that Cindy and folks at the California Preservation Foundation are ready to help as well. So we do have those fact sheets. Like I said, here's an example of that. And a lot of this details you can kind of pull and put into your messages or communicate over the phone with a member. August recess is coming. Members are going back to town. So if you happen to see your member of Congress, bring this up. Bring up the historic tax credit. You know, if you have a 30-second elevator speech, you just say, hey, you know, I hear that the historic tax credit has an opportunity to be enhanced in the infrastructure bill. We hope you will consider including Congressman Blumenauer's provisions in that bill, and also with Senator Cardin as well for if you see a senator back home. And with that, that is the end of the presentation.
Yeah, Mike, I think we had wanted to leave some time for questions. And I don't know, Cindy, if that's your job or our job, or how you want to handle that.
Well, we normally field the questions to you. So we would encourage the audience to submit your questions through the Q&A box. And I'll leave this off and just a comment for our viewers, people attending. If you don't know, I'll tell you, CPF led the charge in getting funding this year for the California State Historic Tax Credit. The tax credit was passed in 2019, but the funding has to be renewed every year through part of the budget process. And it was not included in the governor's budget that was introduced in February, I believe. And we went to bat and lobbied to get that included. And I can tell you that part of our lobbying effort included going out to developers that had projects in the pipeline or that were underway. And I don't think there was one developer that we spoke with that did not run into problems, that had problems either in unforeseen conditions, funding. So the question I think about, or the importance needs to be underscored of how this bill can really help people, because I mean, it was actually quite an eye-opener. Some of the other comments that we heard from developers were how particularly housing, low-income housing developers, was how the money that they saved through use of tax credits would be funneled back into their programs to help people get off the street and get their lives back together. So this kind of crosses boundaries into other social issues as well. Just a quick question, really, to get things going, based on a comment from one of our audiences. How do you see the bill really playing out in California? Given that, as was cited by our viewer, the reason that California has fewer historic tax credit projects is because we have fewer historic buildings, and that the cost of real estate is higher here, and it's more difficult to exceed the adjusted basis.
Yeah, so I think 3 topics. One, if you have a 30% tax credit at the federal level plus the beginning of the state tax credit, obviously the economics are going to be better. 2, if you change that substantial rehab test to make it 50% of your adjusted basis instead of 100, you can do a lot of rehab work really well, but not have to spend up to your acquisition cost, right? Which will be great. And the third thing is, I just think California is at that inflection point in its use of the HTCs, right? Cindy, you've cited a handful of things: available building stock, prices, lack of a state credit, but all those things are getting fixed, right? The mid-century modern architecture of California is now en vogue in the HTC world, and things that were built in the 50s and 60s when your big cities saw their boom times, right? Those are all going to be eligible. Plus, you're putting those other things together. I actually think, whatever, Nebraska doesn't want to hear this, but California could be the greatest beneficiary from this credit, right? So I actually think you all are really well positioned if it happens this year.
Thank you. I had a question from Randolph, and he's interested in hearing if you have any specific examples that you could point to, or maybe just more describe in a general sense. Examples would be even better. But how can nonprofit and private partnerships take advantage of these tax credits? And do you have any ideas of how private? He says he has a difficult time imagining how an organization could partner with a private company and how that actually works.
Sure. So the answer is tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees is the short answer. The longer answer is there are ways to design nonprofit transactions that will allow you to use the HTC to rehab something that's owned by a notprofit. There is a lot of legal work, a lot of accounting work, and a lot of structuring work that go into it. The other things that the Historic Tax Credit Growth and Opportunity Act would do is cut some of that red tape, right? But in short order, one of the things that is a perverse result is in the for-profit world, you are penalized for buying a building and then rehabilitating it because of what Cindy said. You have a very high basis in the property. In the nonprofit world, you are penalized for owning a building for a long time and trying to rehab it because there are these things called prior use rules, and there are sale leaseback restrictions. But what really happens in the simplest of terms, and again, you need a good lawyer, is you create a corporation that creates a 29.5-year or longer lease to the nonprofit to give them that corporation the indicia of ownership over the building, to be able to claim the credit with a for-profit investor in, plus some other people. And you end up with the result that you have a long-term commitment to the nonprofit and to the tax credit investor that's not as long-term, but they can do the building. Now, all of that said, if you got rid of those disqualified lease rules that we talked about in the Historic Tax Credit Growth and Opportunity Act, you still have to follow the IRS's rules. You'd still have to do the right thing, but it would be easier to do. So maybe Mike, you can send them your Caritas or Caritas Richmond. This is a homeless services center in Richmond that NTCIC did. And, we use it all the time. And here's the problem, Randolph, to your question. There's very few examples of these because they're so hard to do, right? There might be one theater in Massachusetts and a couple of things in DC, and then maybe a museum in Maine, but they're so hard for nonprofits to do. I spent months with the Nikola Tesla Science Center in New Jersey somewhere, trying to figure out a way to use credits on the building that they owned that was like Tesla's workshop. I mean, something clearly historic and clearly that's within the mission of the program that just couldn't get over the nonprofit hurdles. And that's where I would say 95% of the nonprofit projects end up. So our examples are usually great and they're highest and best use and they're really good community projects, but they're so hard to do. Most of those don't end up using the federal HTC as a result.
I'll just say, Patrick, that nonprofit projects typically have to be sizable. They have to be large because there has to be enough bandwidth for all the fees to jump through all these legal hoops with attorneys and accountants. One thing that really disappoints me is, for instance, the YMCA owns, these local YMCAs own buildings all across the country that are over 100 years old. Because they own the building, they can't use the HTC to do the rehab. And then we just think that's ridiculous. So we want to give the tools to folks, even if they are nonprofits, to work with developers, to partner with developers to use the HTC. And we're hoping that these provisions pass and it'll bring down that threshold of what's required for a project to work.
Well, thanks. That's a great way to segue into our next question. Our friend Diane says that she lives in La Jolla and they have 2 historically designated properties there in need of rehab. Both are owned by the city of San Diego. So how do historic tax credits help us? Do you want to start with that, Mike?
Sure. I mean, the credit has to be income producing, so it needs to be a commercial property. What you see lots of times is that that cities sell the property usually at a very reduced cost to an entity, whether that's the developer or another developer that has tax liability, and then they use the credit in various financing structures.
Yeah, and again, that's sort of a perverse result as well. You have to get these huge, the old post office in St. Louis, right? The developer ends up buying that for $1 because it's been in such disrepair for decades that it's an albatross that no one can do anything with. So that fixes your basis problem, but you've had 25 years of pain to get there, right? Which is why it's not the way this should really, what we should do is, as buildings reach the end of their useful life, they should be eligible, they should be able to use the credit, whether they're owned by for-profit or nonprofit, and we would have this sort of efficient market, which we don't have now.
I think we have a question from Teresa. And she first of all, a story, all of my construction projects were placed on hold for at least 6 months as a result of the pandemic. Has there been any sort of discussion about extending the 24-month measuring period? And she's saying just temporary relief, not permanent.
So in the original version of sort of a pandemic bill last year, the coalition suggested that the IRS grant sort of waivers on those 24-month substantial rehabilitation periods, and they allowed you to sort of have a 6-month extension over the course of the early part of the pandemic, and I will pull those regs and try to answer in the Q&A while we chat. So Teresa, you have a link to them. Now, I can't promise that they solve the problem that you're looking for, but the IRS and Congress recognized this and tried to find a way to at least provide them.
Cindy, were you going to add something to that?
No, I wasn't.
Oh, okay. Well, I had a question for you, Cindy. You had talked about CPF's involved. Oh, sorry, I'm muted because I have a double mute actually on my microphone. But I was going to ask you a question, Cindy. You had talked about CPF's involvement. Could you maybe just go over that a little bit, like what CPF does in terms of these legislative issues?
Sure. what we do is really act in a support role to NTCIC, the National Trust Preservation Action, some of the national groups that are watching these bills, and we reach out to our legislators in California, our senators and representatives. We either contact them through an organized effort, lobby day or lobby week. Advocacy week is called, lobby days within that week. That's an annual event where we go back to Washington, D.C. every year. Obviously, we didn't go back this year because of COVID. We were there early 2020, just before the pandemic restrictions hit. But we go back and we reach out to our legislators. And recently, like within the last couple of weeks, we've been reaching out to some of our congressional representatives to set up meetings to speak with them and bring in their constituents to talk. Because one of the difficulties that we face as a statewide organization is sometimes we have problems just getting through the door, talking to specific legislators because we are not one of their constituents. So what I would strongly suggest is that anyone who's on this call and is within the district, if any one of those representatives that are on the Ways and Means Committee, some of these committees that have this within their purview, that you reach out to them and let them know how important this is. And furthermore, I can tell you that I have reached out to every one of them, every one of those representatives, California representatives on the Ways and Means Committee, and have asked for meetings. I've not gotten responses, and in large part, I think it's because they respond more or will respond better to a constituent. So I would strongly encourage you to reach out and let them know. We still have some follow-up calls to make with some of these legislators, but we have met with Congressman Gomez in Los Angeles with his staff, and we met with Congressman Mike Thompson and had good calls with each. So it's important for our members to let their legislators know how important this is to them.
Great, thanks, Cindy. And I wanted to ask John a question. John, could you let everybody know about our upcoming program, our part 3 of this series?
More than happy to do that, and I'll be brief here. But we do, as many of you know, a lot of the tax credit and incentive programs rely on the Secretary of Interior standards. So we will be having a Secretary Standards program on the 26th of August. And even more importantly, next Thursday, we have a program covering 3 of the most common incentive programs in the state of California, including the brief sort of overview of where the state historic tax credit will stand. Cindy will kind of briefly talk about that, but we will also be talking about the Mills Act and the federal tax credit as it exists in California. So we do encourage you to follow up on these programs. This will be next Thursday will be a 3-hour program, so it will be more of a deep dive. And I pasted in the chat box, and I'll do it again, but I pasted into the chat box a discount for next Thursday's programs. And as many of you know, all these programs support our educational efforts. We are a 501c3 educational organization, so we take that mission very seriously, and we try to train people as much as possible on these programs. But without your support, we can't do things like this. So we need you to continue to attend programs. And I see Chris put that in there in the chat box. Thank you.
I couldn't remember the code though, John. I'm sure everybody else is saying the same thing. So maybe you could post that code in there. But John's right. We encourage you to join and donate to CPF everywhere that you can, so that we can continue, especially to offer these free programs. And this one is on Facebook Live as well. I want to wrap it up by asking you, Patrick and Mike, where everyone can reach you. Do you have Instagram or Facebook, LinkedIn that you might be able to share?
Sure. You can reach me on LinkedIn, Michael Phillips, National Trust Community Investment Corporation. Would love to connect with you and would love to work with you on enhancing the historic tax credit.
Great. And Patrick, I see you put your email in the chat. And where else can we see your work?
Yeah, you can find me at LinkedIn at Confluence Government Relations. Otherwise, I'm an old man, frankly. So email's the best way to find me, but I'll always answer.
No TikTok. You don't have a TikTok about tax incentives. Wouldn't that be?
No.
That would be raging. That would be so much fun, wouldn't it?
My 10-year-old is pushing hard to get TikTok in the house, and I'm resisting. So I think I have to hold the line for now. Thank you guys so much for having us. Really appreciate it. And to the extent that anyone ever has questions, don't hesitate to reach out. We're happy to do whatever we can to help.
All right, thank you so much. And I guess it's back to you, John, for wrapping it up.
I'm pasting into the chat box a link to our evaluation form for today's program. Please do let us know what you think. And like I mentioned, we hope to see you next Thursday at our next incentive program, or on the 26th for the Secretary Standards. Please check our website for future programs. And thank you both to our wonderful speakers today. I learned a lot. So have a great rest of the day, everybody. And I'm going to close out our recording and our everything today. So I'll see you next week.
Thank you.